Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Beyond COVID-19 series organized by No Peace Without Justice. During this time, everyone's eyes have been on the COVID-19 emergency. We have lately heard about the effects of the global pandemic, the economic recovery, prospects for a vaccine, a second wave perhaps in the global north. It is important that those matters receive the attention they deserve. At the same time, this emergency presents us with new challenges, which have a deep impact on global politics and our society. While our daily lives may feel like they are somehow on hold, human rights violations have not been suspended, and nor has the need for many to access justice for such violations. On the contrary, some of these needs may have intensified due to the implications of the pandemic. For this reason, No Peace Without Justice has decided to organize weekly panels to allow for continued discussion on these important issues, making it easy for you to access it through social media. If you want to share news about this event, you can use the hashtag BeyondCovid19. We also encourage to visit the No Peace Without Justice website, www.npwj.org, and also visit the Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages. Today, we will talk about COVID-19 and its impact on justice. And we have three speakers with us today. I will ask each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Sharon. Sharon Nakandha, please.
Thank you very much, Mariana. My name is Sharon Nakandha. I'm a Ugandan lawyer specialized in international criminal justice, and I work with the Open Society Africa Regional Office. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. George Kegoro. George, could you introduce yourself?
My name is George Kegoro. I'm a Kenyan lawyer. I work for the Kenya Human Rights Commission. We are based in Nairobi.
Thank you, welcome. And Michael Reed-Hurtado.
Thank you. I'm Michael Reed-Hurtado. I'm the Director of Operations at the Guernica Center for International Justice. We're a relatively new organization specializing in the use of law and social sciences to strengthen the quest for meaningful accountability at the national and international level in relationship to human rights abuses and violations. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, it's great to have you all. So, COVID-19 has changed the way we live our lives. And as we've heard repeatedly over the past few months, it will have significant implications in the way the world is shaped going forward. Over the past few months, we've heard about the impact the virus will have on health planning and prioritization, economic inequality, even employers' decisions on office space and remote work, and even urban planning. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly in this context, we have heard quite little about justice. How will the virus shape access to justice in the near and more distant future? And how has access to justice been affected during the lockdown? In particular, how about justice for the most serious crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes? In other words, very serious human rights violations committed in the context of a conflict and or at large scale. Some of us have heard about concerns related to prisoners' release. We have also heard about hearings and other court activity being suspended or altered in other ways due to the lockdown. At the same time, lockdown-related measures have paradoxically led to other abuses, heightening the need for access to justice. For example, in a number of countries, the police and others have resorted to violence to enforce lockdown measures. I was wondering if we could start with you, George. Could you tell us about the situation in Kenya and what has happened in relation to enforcement of lockdown measures?
Thank you very much, Mariana. So the first cases of COVID-19 were now announced officially in Kenya on the 13th of March. And since then, and during the following days, the government started enforcing ever-increasing measures to counter the spread of the coronavirus in Kenya, which have included curfew and measures that prohibit movement into and out of Nairobi and Mombasa and 3 other counties in the country that are regarded as the epicenter of the violence of the COVID-19 infection, and also measures to do with the compulsory wearing of face masks, and also to do with quarantine for people who are suspected to be carrying or to be infected, or their contacts. On the first night that the curfew was announced, police killed 6 people around the country. Since then, the police have killed a total of 21 recorded cases resulting from enforcement measures, which shows you just how violent and brutal the enforcement mechanisms have been. Soon after the first night of the killings, the president came out in public and apologized and took responsibility for the police killings and the police violence, and said that the violence was not acceptable and would not continue. The fact of the president coming out to acknowledging a problem was itself unusual, and it somewhat alleviated the situation. But it did not, the violence has not totally gone away, because as I've already indicated, we continue to have sporadic cases of violence, and some of that results in very serious injury, including some of it resulting in death, as I've already explained. The violence has also affected medical personnel, and there's a bit of official embarrassment in acknowledging that, but our information is that doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel who are exempted from the curfew find themselves on the receiving end of very serious violence, which of course, police violence, which of course interferes with the work that they do. So over time, during the last 3 months or so that the country has had COVID-19 measures, the police, rather than the medical personnel, have become the face of that response, which shows just how serious police violence and police activity and the sort of very brutal forms of enforcement has been such a characteristic form of the experiences the country has had. I would need to say that after the police violence went down, a new form of aggravation became immediately apparent from the monitors that we have in the field. This is bribery. So if police don't use, if violence is not the option as an enforcement, as a way of dealing with the police during the lockdown period, it is through bribery, small bribes, $100 here, and I mean $1 here and $1 there, so that you're able to get around the curfew, around the lockdown restrictions. There's a logic to this, and there's a way in which this violence and this bribery are explained in terms of Kenya's political history and the use of the police as a violent force. Political violence has been an important feature of Kenyan politics and appears in grave measure during elections, including 2007, when we had the country almost degenerating into a civil war situation. So the fact that police have committed, the fact that the choices have been made by political actors to employ police as, to use the police to commit violence in order to gain a political advantage during elections has created a situation where police feel they can't be wished away, and their method of enforcement and brutality can't be wished away, even when the politicians or the political actors don't necessarily intend that to be the case. The use of the opportunity to make money during these types of situations, which have seen huge amounts of bribery going on, is also specifically part of how Kenyan politics has run. If police are used to do regime policing and protecting the people in power, there must be a payback way for them doing that role. So opportunities for them to make money on the population is a very deliberate part of the calculus of how policing is done. The authorities look the other way as police shake down the population for money, because that is the way then the police get to be paid back for keeping the political establishment in power.
Thanks, George. I was wondering, how are you and other human rights workers acting in the situation? How are you monitoring what's going on, and are you conducting any advocacy efforts in relation to the situation you just described?
So we have deployed on the field very widely across the country. We've got field monitors who send us periodic reports, who investigate individual situations that may be egregious and that are reported to us and verify those. And there's a multiplicity of agencies, including official agencies, that carry out documentation and investigation and reporting, and we are doing that ourselves. So the information we have about police violence and killings has been verified because of the way we have deliberately organized ourselves to collect information from the field. We have had very, very few opportunities for advocacy because of the lockdown. We can't easily meet officials. We can't easily have engagement with officials in the way that used to be the case. But we try and creatively reach out to them and pass our messaging, but we also use media and public communication as a way of stating our findings and also articulating what we expect to be the responses from the authorities. But I would say that the level of engagement with the authorities has degraded significantly. I should have added, when talking about the brutality that has been experienced during COVID-19, the fact that we've had very, very egregious cases of mass eviction and demolitions of housing during this period. In one neighborhood in the poor areas of Nairobi, police descended in a small village of about 8,000 people, and amid driving rain, which has characterized the experiences of the country during this period, flattened the place and evicted everybody. They did that in a different neighborhood within Nairobi, two other different neighborhoods within Nairobi. They've also done that in Kenya's second city, Mombasa. And so you've had significant amount of evictions, mass evictions taking place during this period. We think that those evictions were always intended and were always planned. It is difficult to carry out evictions because there are political consequences for evicting such large numbers of people. We think that the conditions of lockdown and the conditions of degraded associational life have provided a perfect cover for carrying out those evictions. So COVID-19 has provided a cover for the government to carry out mass evictions, to which there's very little opportunity for mass response of organized response because people are supposed to be in lockdown.
Thanks, George. That's all very concerning. You spoke now about the challenges that you face in your work as a human rights defender, and I was wondering if I could turn to Michael now. For you, Michael, to speak about the challenges that lawyers and human rights activists face in general in the work to promote access to justice during this time.
Sure, thank you, Mariana. And I think just evolving from the comments presented by George, coinciding with them, as Guernica Center, we promoted a brief survey conducted through semi-structured interviews of persons, both experts, activists, community representatives, of all sorts, in the various regions of the world that work around the issue of promoting accountability. And though each context is very much conditioned by specific circumstances, we were able to identify some takeaways that are fairly common to all of those. And I think those are useful to highlight in this context. The first one, and I think it coincides quite a bit with what has been said, is in fact that the loss of mobility, the need to also just survive and figure out how to make ends meet in a daily basis has greatly limited the momentum of social movements that were demanding and making claims. That also has been resisted by the fact that some governments have put in place exceptional measures justified by the combating of the virus, but that are really limiting individual liberties. This is not to say that some of these measures are not rationally related to what we need to present. However, there's certain overreach taking place, and there is no doubt that in fact the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic are greatly curbing the possibility of people to mobilize, to make claims, and to conduct their work. This is probably seen at the professional level and at the levels of urban centers, but it is also claimed by those that are in rural realities where often the lack of state presence has led to the appearance of other actors or those actors being more explicitly present in the territory to control. So I think the first impact, without a doubt, is a direct impact to social mobilization and a control over social mobilization. A second takeaway, or a second big conclusion as well, is there has definitely been public and private shifting away from human rights causes and from accountability of past crimes. And everything has been concentrating on COVID and COVID-related responses. Again, it is very justified to deal with both the humanitarian as well as the economic impact of COVID, but this should not imply putting all social structural issues on the back burner. We need to figure out a way, as in any other emergency situation, on how to deal with the emergency, but to see it in the context of other structural inequalities and on other important social issues that are not going to go away and are likely just to worsen over time in the context of something like this pandemic. As we are seeing the months evolving, clearly these differences are definitely set up. The third element is related to the response by governments. And again, where some of those measures and exceptional and extraordinary measures might be justified, as soon as they lose the link with the rationality, as well as the limits on content and the control mechanisms in democratic life, we have seen many governments that have just clearly justified, as a result of COVID, measures that are way out of proportion, and that in addition to that are without a doubt having an effect of either generating new human rights violations or doing away with long-term democratic controls in those societies. And there again, we see the pertinence of justice and accountability coming in, no longer in relationship to crimes of the past, but now in relationship to crimes or crimes of state, or extreme acts of corruption, or abuses of power and excessive violence, as was highlighted already. And the last thing, in order to move on, that we should probably talk a lot about is also the fact that many of these cases related to crimes of the past basically came to a standstill. And again, understood for a while, temporary, everybody's shaken up, we need to adjust, we need to adapt. But all of a sudden, it starts moving forward, and we're not so certain on how to adapt and deal with these issues. In some cases, it must be said that the call to stop cases simply adds to all the backsliding and obstacles that already existed in relationship to accountability of crimes of the past. And if you think about it, really, the call to stop procedures or criminal processes is somewhat in line with all the delay tactics that parties are interested in these causes. Now, on the other hand, one must also say we need to be very careful with these very sensitive cases that involve high litigious activity, as well as very important symbolic value on how justice is ritualized and how justice is conducted. Though we are quite accustomed to streaming proceedings online, it is not the same to stream a proceeding in the ICC or in a hybrid court or in a special transitional justice than in fact to take the environment virtual and conduct a criminal proceeding all of a sudden via virtual means. It might seem familiar to the spectator, but to those involved, there are very serious dilemmas that we need to consider, particularly conducting justice in the virtual courtroom. And those are considerations of due process, and that is due process not just for the defendant, but for all parties involved. And there's also considerations in relationship to the symbolic effect that these cases, very scarce, tend to have in relationship to the message they're sending in relationship to the past. Again, I think the adaptation of the justice mechanism deserves a lot deeper consideration. And probably something that we should turn to. There are no easy answers, but these problems are not going to go away. So it is time to, in fact, advance. These are not hypothetical concerns. These concerns are playing out in the context of Spain, for example, a case regarding a 30-year-old massacre in the Jesuit University in El Salvador is actually being conducted and having to use some of these mechanisms. As most people know, there's also a case regarding the commission of atrocities in the context of Syria. And there's also been some discussion in the context of Africa, particularly in South Africa, regarding all cases. Again, these are not hypothetical cases. These are cases that we need to prepare for. These are not easy solutions, but we need to debate them in order to adopt mechanisms that are appropriate. There is no doubt that the pandemic is having a very serious impact, and that for now, we need to, in fact, regain the momentum of the quest for accountability. Otherwise, this alignment of circumstances could very, very much lead to not having just justice stalled for a little bit, but fully hijacked by the current circumstances.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'd like to turn to Sharon now. Sharon, I know you've been looking into the specific impact that the pandemic has had on documentation efforts. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about what your research has yielded in this respect and your conversations with other civil society colleagues in the continent. What have you learned, and what is it that you'd like to share with us?
All right, thank you, Mariana. And I think I've been thinking about this subject for quite some time, since the pandemic started. And I look at COVID-19 as the gift that keeps on giving for persons who commit mass atrocities. Because you're now in a situation where everybody's attention, whether it's government, whether it's communities, is on the pandemic. So in this moment, you can actually thrive. We had the UN Secretary General coming up with the global call for a ceasefire. Guess what happened? Very few groups took it up, armed groups. very few governments paid any attention to it. So they're using this moment to actually commit more atrocities, perhaps even more than they did previously, when everyone's attention would be quickly drawn to these atrocities. So what's happening now? We have partners in Mali who have told us, well, at this point, you have intercommunal violence going up. You have armed terrorist groups in the region. You also have government counterterrorism responses leading to death of civilians. You've seen the same thing in the DRC as well. You heightened violence in Ituri. We had a statement out by the ICC prosecutor. You have essentially seen everyone's attention, while everyone's attention is focused on COVID, in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, the violence still continues. The best part about this for persons who commit mass atrocities is that no one is watching. Previously, the civil society groups that would ideally quickly mobilize, quickly document some of these things that are happening and take the information out to the public, and at least fight advocacy, conduct some sort of advocacy around these issues, demand accountability. Well, guess what? They no longer have the means in this moment because of some of the measures that have been put up by governments because of COVID-19. If you have social distancing rules, if you have lockdowns, so people can commit these crimes under essentially what I would like to call a cover of darkness. Groups are now extremely puzzled because suddenly they have to be forced to adapt to this changing world. You can't sit back and say that you're not going to monitor because these atrocities are happening and it's this COVID period. You're not going to do that. So you have to figure out creative ways of still monitoring the situation. Now, that is exactly where most of them face a major, major challenge. How do you continue to document? Perhaps it's time for us to think of technology. Perhaps it's time for us, like George mentioned earlier, have monitors in the field, find creative ways of them continuing to do their work. Because otherwise, you can't sit back and watch. Whereas accountability is largely dependent on the information that groups provide us with for some of these accountability processes. So I'm telling you, Mariana, it's extremely puzzling for most of them. They've woken up, it's a new age, it's a new era. You have to continue to work, you have to continue to demand for accountability, and you essentially have to get creative. So that is one of the biggest challenges that groups are facing. Now, at the moment, if you see some of the news we've received, say in Nigeria, the recent Boko Haram attacks that happened, partly the information, when it comes out, it's usually journalists who would have gotten it for the rest of the world. It would be UN agencies. You will seldom, for the last few weeks, if you monitor closely, you will seldom find human rights groups being the ones saying that they release this information. They are also dependent on secondary sources. So again, it goes back to the question of, first of all, how are we as philanthropists investing in this area of work? Perhaps we need to step up and we need to adjust and start to advise groups on how to continue working. How do you continue documenting atrocities in this period? How do you ensure that people do not thrive in this time, that governments do not have excuses, quietly raise down homes of innocent civilians because everyone is not paying attention. So again, Mariana, it is a tough time for lots of groups that have previously been used to the traditional way of documenting. They physically visit the location, speak to people, and suddenly now with COVID, they can no longer do that. So it's quite puzzling, I must say.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you all of you for a very comprehensive picture on what's happening in the field, and in the field concretely, the countries where you work, and in the field of justice generally. I'd like to turn now to the impact on the justice system and the impact on courts. Michael briefly spoke about the impact on the judicial system, but you said, Michael, well, there will be a need to adapt, but there are limitations, there are challenges. Not all hearings can be conducted remotely. How can we address those challenges? What advice do you have?
Well, first, I think it's the realization that this is a very complex problem and there are no easy answers. The go-to solution is to make everything virtual, in part because we have kind of gotten accustomed to this mechanism. So if we can do it, why not? Most people's experience with justice, very strangely, is not in the context of a court of law, but rather through television. So again, the medium is very much set for why not go virtual? And that works against us. Secondly, we have been streaming procedures, over the internet for several years now. I think ever since the ICTY, it kind of started being a fairly familiar mechanism where you can in fact tune in here or there with more sophisticated...
Sorry to interrupt you, Michael. The ICTY is the International Court...
Sorry, the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia. So in the context of those international cases, it became fairly familiar to kind of be able to pop into a court of law and through a camera get that kind of bird's eye view of what was happening. I think transitional justice mechanisms that implemented either hybrid mechanisms or very sophisticated national mechanisms got us all accustomed to the fact that we could have virtual hearings. And this was before the pandemic. All this does is it lays down the ground for saying, yes, it is natural to turn to virtual means. However, that is not an easy decision. Doing justice is about being present in a particular place. It is about a specific ritual, but it is particularly about safeguards. Safeguards that are there in order to avoid the incursion of power of the state in relationship to individuals who are accused of committing a crime. And due process has been structured in order to, in fact, defend against the abuse of power by the justice system and by the state. So we need to remember, whenever we are also thinking about the design and the administration of cases related to human rights clauses, when those sitting in the position of the accused or the defendant, not just because we see them as monsters, all of a sudden they have no rights and definitely no due process right. On the contrary, it's a moment where we need to be a lot stronger about the formal guarantees and the material guarantees that attach to anybody who faces a judicial proceeding, so that the conviction against those individuals can be strong and can be defended on values of rule of law. Secondly, the ceremony and the ritual that goes on in a court of law is very important symbolically for victims. Very few victims are actually going to get their day in court. In situations of mass atrocity, as the ones that have taken place in Latin America or Africa or Asia, very few cases actually reach the judicial moment of trial. And in those cases, being present is extremely important. Maybe in some cases regarding civil litigation of minor matters, virtual means are important. In fact, virtual courts in the context of traffics or minor misdemeanors makes sense. However, for human rights causes, victims tend to attribute a lot of symbolism to the moment of doing justice. They want justice being done. They want to be able to see how it gets structured and how, in fact, the defendant needs to stand trial. That cannot happen virtually. And in fact, in the context of human rights cases that proceed against the state, there have been several victims that have explicitly presented that point of view, saying, we've been patient, waiting for 14 years. You can now not ask me now to reduce the moment that I've waited for 14 years to have my day in court in the context of a human rights case, to open up a laptop and see something happening on the screen during 4 hours. I've been waiting for this time for 14 years. I'd much rather wait 1 year or 2 years, even if it means, and this literally comes from their letter, that one of the 3 that was waiting might die in the moment of waiting, but they'd much rather wait for that symbolic moment in court. Now, I think as was highlighted by Sharon as well, it's also important to realize that COVID is somehow conspiring with, let's put everything on hold and let's wait and see. So all of a sudden, it also has become an excuse to not investigate, an excuse to not move cases forward, and even an excuse to get people out of jail that have not demonstrated that there is any link with them running any risk in their particular conditions, but that they are instrumentally arguing the risk from COVID in order to get a get out of jail free card. So there again, I think we need to come in and balance all the issues that are at stake, and remember that doing justice is about due process. Doing justice in atrocity cases is also about symbolism and ritualism. Doing justice is about communication, not just legal, but also social and political, and that all those things need to be weighed in. Currently, we're seeing these things come down in very, very different ways. In the context of South Africa, there was an inquest where the victims requested a stay in relationship to that process moving forward, and it was basically related to a lot of issues. The victims themselves were in an isolated community, not easy access to internet. They couldn't travel through the country, so they couldn't get to where the proceeding was going to take place. The representatives of victims also felt that they would not be able to properly test witness evidence through virtual means, but that they had to do that personally and physically. So in that case, it was the victims that actually requested the stay in that procedure, and in fact, the court allowed that stay. So here the victims are requesting that stay. In the context, in a very different context in Europe, there is a case proceeding against the Vice Minister of Defense in El Salvador. This is for the killing of 6 Jesuit priests and 2 Salvadoran women. This is an event that took place in 1989. Victims have been waiting for 30 years in this case. This individual was grabbed on an administrative violation in the United States, extradited to Spain, where he is now standing trial for the murders of the Spanish victims of that massacre, not all victims. However, in that case, victims decided to move forward with the case, and it's a case that's being conducted more in a hybrid type mechanism. The case is in itself in the national audience of Spain, and the special chambers, criminal chambers in Spain. However, some witnesses and one of the lawyers are abroad, so they're using virtual means in order to come into the court and so forth, and proceed in that case. The initial hearings took place over a course of three days, and there was an agreement by all parties to have the key witness try to come in for the second part of those hearings to be held later on in July. So that's kind of a mechanism through which both are used. And again, we have the more notorious case where adaptations to the physical courtroom in Germany were put in place in order for the Syrian case to move forward. I think here, justice is about the law. It's also about cultural messages. It's about social messages. So we need to be aware of what justice means in every single country and what we're trying to present. There is not an easy fix by simply saying, let's go virtual. These are very complicated discussions, and anything involving due process we need to consider from the position of the judge and all of the parties involved, not just the defendant, but also the prosecution. And in those cases that either have a civil party or a private prosecution present, or representatives of victims in the new procedural mechanisms, we definitely need to consider them. These issues are only starting, and do remember, and I think it's kind of the common point between all of us, unfortunately, justice for past crimes and for atrocities is not the norm, but rather the exception. So we need to be very cautious with these cases and make sure we get it right. Last thing we want to do is try to push a case forward and provide the excuse for the situation that leads to either an appeal or, in fact, a reversal of judgment based on some type of constitutional revision of the case as it proceeded.
Thank you, Michael. That's a lot of food for thought for anyone planning virtual hearings or hearings in general in the near future. You spoke about victims and the fact that many of them have waited for many years to access justice. Sharon, I know you have worked a lot with victims and in your country, Uganda, and elsewhere. What do we know about the situation of victims and communities at the moment? Do we know how they feel? Do we know how they're acting and reacting to the current situation? What can you share with us?
Thank you very much, Mariana, for that. First of all, I think the one thing we have to always remember and accept, it's something I accept, every society has vulnerable populations. There is something that war does and changes about a community. So once you have COVID coming in and you have measures, government measures that are implemented across the board without taking into account the specificities and the realities of different communities, then you have got it wrong. And I think that's where our governments, I'll speak for myself, my government got it absolutely wrong. You cannot implement, I know you're fighting a pandemic, but once you use warlike language to a community, you're saying we are fighting a war. Those are already memories of conflict for that community. People are still recovering from the effects of what happened to them. The government, schools were destroyed, health centers were destroyed. You have not invested in them over time. And well, COVID is happening. You're now back to the drawing board. You have had development programs across, the country, invested in them recklessly in many ways, lots of corruption. And now guess what? COVID is happening. People must run to these health centers that have nothing. And then one of the most unfortunate and absolutely terrible incidents I watched was some of the women, informal traders who were kicked around by the government, loaded on a truck, sent to jail because they were trying to earn a living. This is a post-conflict context where people, it is survival, basically. So you arrest them on the basis of COVID. You send them, load them up to prison. What message are you sending as a government? It means you have not taken into account the vulnerabilities they already face. So I'll take, must you always police everything and every society? I guess that goes back to, the experiences. What is justice? Justice sometimes is even that socio-economic cover, that mental stability, your government prioritizing you, looking at your reality as someone who went through conflict. When a pandemic happens, any measures the state takes, whereas, yes, the state should protect you, they must also take into account your realities. You cannot come and police in such senseless fashion, recklessly, to a community that's still recovering from the effects of conflict. And again, this also reminds me the challenges we are seeing today with the government implementing some of, the COVID response measures generally, whether it's economic measures, after COVID, the same gaps we have seen, less investment in the health sector, less investment in education. They're running around like headless chickens. Well, guess what? we have seen the same thing happen when it comes to the development programs they set up for victims. So I think there are lots of interesting lessons to learn about, just how we respond to things, how we take into account the vulnerabilities of certain sections of our societies. You have some of the victims who are persons with disabilities. How are they affected by this pandemic? How did you take into account that reality of theirs? You have some of the victims who do not even have a home. Some of them are children born in conflict who do not actually have a home. They are running around, their families have rejected them. Suddenly you're telling them, oh, there is a curfew time. Where do you want them to stay? Where do you want them to go? So I think there's some mistakes we've made, we the professionals as well, the elites of our society, and the government as well, because it's us, the elites, who should actually at some point speak up on behalf of some of these vulnerable people and tell our governments, you know what, take into account their sensitivities, their realities, work with us so that we figure out a way to help them. Some of them have no food. You're distributing food in a completely different location, not taking into account some of those who already do not have. So I get, Mariana, I could go on and on because honestly, it upsets me to say the least.
Thank you. It upsets us all. And I think all of us could carry on with this conversation for a very long time, but we are coming to the end of it. To close, I'd like to ask each of you to make a call for action if you have one. What can ordinary citizens do in your view? I'll ask you to be very, very brief. So think of something that people can do and tell us about it in less than 1 minute. I'll start with George. George, you need to, yes.
I had okay. COVID-19 has shown that the government, it has shown the inadequacy of government across the globe, but also within the African context. The years of lack of investment in social services has been exposed very, very starkly in the context of COVID-19. If there's anything that citizens need to demand, they need to demand an investment in social services. If a government can't invest in social services, it is difficult to justify why it exists.
Thank you. Michael, over to you.
Sure. So in 1 minute, I do think one of the issues, and very much linked to all the comments as well that Sharon has presented, we do see in this very difficult situation still the capacity to resist, to adapt, to be very creative and resilient in many of the social sectors throughout the globe. Again, this is done nationally and locally, but I must start from an extreme recognition by all groups to continue doing this. Secondly, a confirmation by all the groups of the need to take the human rights perspective to address impacts of COVID and to see COVID not as the one generating social disarray, but as impacting it and making pre-existing conditions worse in order to make those more visible. And then lastly, I would highlight the fact that has been said, we need to continue documenting. The way we're able to demand accountability is in fact to confront the denial that is taking place in relationship to those atrocities continuing now. I think there we can use a lot of tools to do that documentation. And then lastly, the quest for accountability is alive and well, and this is just another obstacle that we need to confront.
Thank you. Sharon, over to you for your call to action.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So, key thing, just 2 messages. Justice is not, it's not an option. in this moment. Whether you have COVID or not, that is something we must always be mindful in our various capacities. When the pandemic finally comes to one end, we must always remember that we at least stood up and spoke up when some things were going wrong, especially speaking up for those who are not as privileged as we are. Those who cannot join the various webinars, those who cannot speak out for themselves. We are that voice on their behalf. We are supposed to speak out, we're supposed to think creatively. If it means let's figure out how to document in this moment, let's figure out how to organize. We do that because we have the tools. Perhaps others do not, and that is something we must help them do. We must elevate their voices without necessarily making them lose their agency in the discussion. I think that is when governments will take civil society seriously. That is when they'll know that we are here to stay and we are not, you know, I've had some of our politicians refer to us as those noisemakers. We're not noisemakers. We make things happen. We speak out for others. I think that's the key message coming out of this entire COVID conversation.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you very much, all three of you. You've shared very concrete calls for action, and you've also shared very interesting perspectives today. For those of you watching this talk, please share the video if you liked it, and join this series next week for another talk on an interesting topic. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, good day.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.